Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's CALC seminar. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who, along with other First Nations communities, have lived on these lands for thousands of years and endured European invasion. I pay my respects to elders past and present and to those who live modestly on country as carers and custodians. Most of you know me, but anyone listening to this as a YouTube video later on may not. So my name is Monique Rooney. I teach and research in the English program at the ANU in Canberra. And with Dr. Tyne Sumner, I co-direct the Centre for Australian Literary Cultures, also known as CALC. CALC is dedicated to raising the visibility of Australian literature locally and internationally by fostering interdisciplinary dialogue among scholars, writers, and readers across the world. So I can't think of a scholar whose work is more interdisciplinary than that Dr. Alexis Harley's, who Alexis lectures in English literature at La Trobe University and works at the intersection of literary and scientific discourses from the late 18th century onwards. Alexis is the author of Autobiologies, Charles Darwin and the Natural History of the Self from 2014, a study of how life writing and evolutionary theory inform one another. Her research traces the ways that cultures of aesthetics and emotion have shaped how people come to know nature. Across a wide-ranging body of work, from essays on Blake to more recent pieces like Writing the Lives of Fungi at the End of the World and Domesticating Climate, Alexis brings a wonderfully attentive, stylistically agile approach to the history of ideas. As she's put it elsewhere, 18th and 19th century scientific writing can be read not only for its discoveries, but also for its stylistic innovation. From polymorphous scholarly forms to moments when scholars wrote as poets, philosophers, and experimentalists all at once. Her talk today, titled Snakes, continues this interest in the borderlands between literature, science, and the imagination. So please join me in welcoming Alexis.
Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction, Monique. I don't think anyone has ever said so many beautiful things about I feel seen in a way that I have never felt seen before. So that was a bit unexpected and lovely. Thank you. And thank you all for being here on Zoom today. It means a lot to me that you saw that I'd be giving a paper on snakes and you didn't all immediately say no. I want to echo Monique's acknowledgement of country, and as I turn to the subject of snakes in the settler Australian imaginary, I particularly want to recognise that I'm here on a stolen and storied land in which beings like the snake are not just symbols, but powerful presences in land, language, and law. I'm going to be speaking today about the uses to which snakes are put in settler literary culture over the colonial period up to and around the period of federation, so the 1890s, perhaps into the 1910s. Can we call that a peri-federation period? Not because I see that as the end of the colonial period, which from the most important perspectives persists to this day, but because I want to home in on that period as an important moment for bedding down the mythic architecture of national identity. So a few caveats. Firstly, I'm obviously not going to be offering some kind of comprehensive overview of the mythic architecture of national identity. I really just want to tease out one corner of how snakes are conscripted into that architecture. And secondly, I'm profoundly conscious that I'm far from having or giving an exhaustive overview of the role of snakes in Australian literary or representational cultures. And it would be a wonderful thing in the discussion time at the end of this paper if you could fill me in on all the obvious textual snakes that I don't mention. Thank you in advance for that. And thirdly, I'm not speaking about the significance of snakes in First Nations literature. But that would be an amazing paper. And I guess I'll just go so far as to say that there are, it seems to me, as a non-expert on First Nations literatures, that there are profound differences in the ways First Nations and settler writers in this continent invoke snakes. And one of those differences is the figure of the ancestral serpent, as Alexis writes, Carpentaria opens, a creature larger than storm clouds that comes down from the stars laden with its own creative enormity. And that ancestral serpent manifests in kind of profound and signifying ways across genres by First Nations authors, from Carpentaria to Rebecca Sykes' autobiographical trilogy, the Snake Cradle, Snake Dreaming, Snake Circle trilogy, to Amble and Quaymulliner's Asher Wolf speculative fiction series, where the character Ashala communicates with grandfather serpent, to Udru New Knuckles' Rainbow Serpent poetry collection, Evelyn Araluen prose poem Snake Dream, Kim Scott's and Ryan Brown's Norn, a story about human-snake alliance. Tyson Yunkaporta and his partner Megan Kelleher have just in the last month published Snake Talk, which is a book about, I've only read the introduction, I have to confess, and want to read more, obviously, but it explores First Nations snakes from many story traditions and places, and shines more light than I can do on what snakes mean in First Nations story. So I will be talking about settler colonial literatures of Australia, rather than Indigenous literatures. From the very moments of anything resembling a print culture in the penal colony of New South Wales, snake stories begin to circulate. I should just say, by the time I get to the end of this paper, I will have differentiated a bit between the ways in which those publishing for a British audience about the colony of New South Wales represent snakes, and those writing for the colonial readership do so. So at this stage, I'm talking very much about how snakes are figured by colonial writers in New South Wales for a colonial readership. A quick search for the word snake in the archive of the Sydney Gazette, thank you, Trove, as always, will show how concerned colonists had become with snakes and how newsworthy anything to do with snakes was supposed to be. The first mention in the Gazette of a snake occurs in 1803, which is the first year that this organ existed, and it's the story of a duel between, quote, a very large black snake and, by contrast, a little terrier at South Head, on the mouth of Port Jackson. There's also a woman, a boatsman, a hoe, and at the end of the story, a dead snake and a dead dog. The two most commonly occurring black snakes around Sydney are what I call the red-bellied black snake, known to herpetologists as Pseudechus porphyriacus, and its cousin, the blue-bellied black snake, Pseudechus guttatus, both frequently described as unusually shy. The Australian Museum notes that the blue-bellied black snake, while shy, will defend itself aggressively if threatened. It will first give a warning display, hissing loudly, holding its flattened forebody in a low S shape. Further harassment will cause the snake to strike out, although it usually does so with a closed mouth. And if the snake is then further provoked, it will bite, and sometimes then hangs on and chews, ensuring a good dose of venom is injected. So a shy snake, as snakes go. By contrast, terriers are not usually shy. So I think it's worth noting that in the reporting of the Sydney Gazette, it's supposedly the snake who attacks the terrier and who is the dog's antagonist. And this is the first of a frequently occurring set of ideas about snake bites in Sydney. In 1805, a black snake again attacks, we read, a lamb, and then attacks the shepherd. In this case, the shepherd survives. In 1806, we get the poignant story of a fine boy bit in the left arm by a large black snake. While not all of the snakes alluded to in the Sydney Gazette are large black snakes, there is, for instance, the story of a 7-foot-long diamond python killed near Georges River. There's a bite from a green tree snake and occasional references to bites from nondescript snakes. The figure of the black snake as an aggressor predominates. The Thomas Scotto, I'm going to say Scotto, but maybe someone here knows that it's pronounced Scottow, or some other Scottiff, who knows. Anyway, I'll just go with Scotto for now, and you can correct me later. The Thomas Scotto manuscript, which was produced in Newcastle in 1813, lists 5 species of snakes. You might be able to see them there: the brown snake, the black snake, the diamond snake, the water snake, and the grass snake. So those are snakes that have been encountered by settlers around the Newcastle area. He writes, "These noxious reptiles are all venomous. The black snake is, however, the worst, its bite being almost instantaneously mortal." Those of us who were raised with the kind of snake panic that I was raised with in the Sydney region at the end of last century will know that reputedly these days the most venomous and also the most aggressive snake in the area is supposed to be the eastern brown. So these claims from the early colonial records of the remarkable aggression and lethality of black snakes strikes me as interesting, different from the law that I encountered. I have no doubt that colonists and their dogs were encountering snakes and that bites and deaths on both sides were occurring. But I do doubt some of the claims about black snakes being the principal aggressors. And I guess I have two theories about this. One is that colonists were imagining the blackness of these snakes in a transposition of their anxiety about or antipathy towards the people whose land they were invading. The other quite interesting thing to bear in mind is that for some time, colonial natural historians were under the misapprehension that the eastern brown snake was the female version of the red-bellied black snake, that it was a profoundly sexually dimorphic single species. So here is George Bennett, who was secretary and curator of the Australian Museum on Macquarie Street from 1835 to 1841, commended to that role by the British Empire's preeminent comparative anatomist Richard Owen. And he would write in his Gatherings of a Naturalist in Australasia, as you can see in the first sentence of the second paragraph here, that the brown snake is doubtless the female of the preceding snake he's been talking about, the red-bellied black snake, and equally venomous, he claims. As you can also read on this page, if you can bear to, various experiments have been conducted by this stage in trying to induce snakes to bite dogs, a puppy and a dingo, in order to study the results of the dog's envenomation. You might also see there Bennett's claim that Indigenous experts have told him that the red-bellied black snake's bite is not deadly. He disputes this with the case of the puppy, but these experts' claims are consonant with wisdom these days. I see a number of pretty authoritative claims that, while, don't try this at home, but there are no verified accounts of adults dying from red-bellied black snake bites on this continent. Although there are, of course, plenty of cases of smaller animals like dogs and potentially young children dying from red-bellied black snake bites simply because they're younger and so the venom, or smaller rather, not younger, smaller, and so the venom is able to do more damage in them. So we're seeing a kind of concretizing of a white settler understanding about the aggressive and deadly black snake against Indigenous wisdom, and it turns out kind of against, preemptively against scientific knowledge of our period. I want to hurry along now to the 1890s and to a period that there's no need to explain to this audience was immensely important for settler Australia's understanding of its own identity and for the emergence of a particular understanding of the form and purpose of an emergent national literature. And I want to ask particularly how snakes figure in what I'm going to call a biblical typology of Australia. Just to explain what I mean by biblical typology, typology is a Christian theological method with a very long history that became particularly popular after the Protestant Reformation and remains so amongst Protestants into the 19th century. What typology is basically looking to Old Testament events or peoples or individuals as types through which to interpret the New Testament. So the example I've written down for you, and this will mean a great deal to you, I'm sure, is the Old Testament relationship between Gomer, the promiscuous wife of Hosea, and her husband. I'm sorry about this, might be read as a type for the infidelity of early New Testament Christians who need to be brought back to their husband Christ. Typology also becomes an exegetical tool for things outside of the Bible, for history, for one's own identity, as we see in a lot of 18th and 19th century religious autobiography. In their colonization of the east coast of North America, English settlers routinely invoked biblical types to understand what they were doing. Indigenous land as their promised land, themselves as God's chosen people. Philip Gorski's 2017 book, American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, relays how in August 1776, Benjamin Franklin proposed the Great Seal of the United States, which of course ended up being the imperial bald eagle, he proposed basically Moses drowning Pharaoh, Pharaoh in this case being King George III, Moses being um, the free and resistant people of America. By contrast to this white American biblical typology in which the Puritans and other settler Americans figure themselves as the Israelites who've escaped from Egypt and taken possession of the Promised Land, enslaved people in America developed a song tradition in which they figured themselves as the Israelites still in exile and bondage to Egypt. So, by comparison, contemporary white Australia prides itself on its notional secularism, and compared with many of this country's closest neighbours, Pacifica nations, for instance, where the first waves of colonisation were missionary-led, the first acts of colonisation in Australia were military or technically naval. The kind of biblical typology as a practice for interpreting and representing the present tense that is writ large in US American colonial history is far less overt, I'd say, in colonial Australia than it was in the US. But I'm going to try and show in this paper via the snake or in relation to the snake that it exists and that it's pretty miserable. William Lyons, in his, I think, still pretty great 1991 book, Taming the Great Southern Land, A History of the Conquest of Nature in Australia, argues that in contrast to the European preconception of North America, no Antipodean invader ever entertained a sentimental vision of Australia as nature's garden, a prelapsarian Eden. Quite the opposite. To the British, Australia stood in need of redemption. For the influential men of the colony, civilizing Australia constituted an imperial mission, a long journey of biblical proportions through a dark wood to a transfigured landscape. Lyons cites the example of Baron Field, the Judge Advocate of New South Wales, and a crucial author of the legal fiction of Terra Nullius, as my colleague Tom Ford and some other guy have recently demonstrated in their, I'm just doing this elaborate citation now because Tom's present, in their book, Baron Field in New South Wales, The Poetics of Terra Nullius. Correct? Yes. Out at now and available in all good bookstores. So in 1921, Baron Field wrote about his relief in emerging from a long, oh, sorry, that's not him. I'll I don't have a slide for this, sorry. His relief in emerging from a long journey through bush into a settled district. Explaining this relief, Field says that his feelings will be recognised by other Australians, he calls them Australians, interestingly, in 1821, other Australians, quote, accustomed to travel through the eternal valley of the shadow of monotonous woods, for whom the charm of emerging into anything like European scenery will be duly appreciated. The valley of the shadow of death is a line from the biblical Psalm 23, and Field's expression, the eternal valley of the shadow of monotonous woods, representing unsettled or unstolen land as hell, given how little shade eucalypts make, we can be sure is a metaphorical shadow, a deliberate kind of writing into the sort of sense of Australia as a place of exile from paradise rather than as paradise. I'm not sure if it's entirely true that no Antipodean invader ever figured this land as a prelapsarian Eden, but I think it's close to true. And where we do find celebratory accounts by colonists of non-European lives or ecologies in this continent, I think they're usually invoking not the biblical Eden, but a kind of romantic primitivism. And now I'm going to cite Rachel Weaver's 2020 book, Colonial Kangaroo Hunt, which she also co-authored with someone, which relays the story of a merchant called John Bingle, who takes possession of land north of Newcastle in the 1820s and travels to Lake Macquarie south of Newcastle, probably not long after Baron Field complained about the shadow of the monotonous woods. So Bingle writes about this place. The whole surrounding country and lake were serene and still. Solitude reigned, no tree disturbed, and no trace of the white man's civilization, but all in its natural wild state. We enjoyed all. The wild sports of Australian bush life in its primitive state, as the Aborigines of that day, before they were contaminated with our vices, were accustomed to enjoy them. Shooting, fishing, kangarooing, and hunting, our game was ample for us all. So Weaver and her co-author gloss this as a fascinating prelapsarian colonial fantasy, with settlers imagining themselves in a primitive space before colonisation, I think I have this on a, no, I don't. Yes, there it is. A fascinating prelapsarian colonial fantasies. Sorry, with settlers imagining themselves in a primitive space before colonisation, hunting native species according to the fantasy, just as Aboriginal people once did. Weaver and her co-author importantly, sorry, I'll just call him Gelder, it's getting a bit silly, importantly note that Bingle's celebration of this natural wild state as somehow unaffected by the white man's civilization, ironically depends on the land being territorialized enough by white men that they can step into the place of the supposedly contaminated, supposedly primitive people who've been dispossessed of their land. I think that's a really excellent point that they make. But I mention Bingle's case as it's an example of an Antipodean invader in Leibniz's terms, who's been described by Gelder and Weaver as representing a prelapsarian Eden. I would read, on the other hand, Bingle's sentiments not in terms of the religious type of a prelapsarian Eden, but as a sign of a romantic primitivism that fetishizes the idea of primitive life as a positive counterpoint to modernity. Expressions of primitivism in this form in colonial Australia are, I want to say, fairly limited. While Rousseau is the clearest articulator of romantic primitivism for continental Europe, especially through ideas like the noble savage and his critiques of civilization, voices in England exploring primitivist themes take a crucially different approach. We see the emergence of an English primitivism in, say, William Blake's critiques of industrialization or William Wordsworth's idealization of the primitive in the form of rural life and childhood innocence. So whereas Rousseauvian primitivism encourages Europeans to idealize supposedly wild indigenous people in supposedly faraway paradisiacal wildernesses, the English romantic primitivism, which is exported to Australia under British occupation, for the most part transmutes into a form of pastoralism. Rousseauvian primitivism, as we're seeing in this quote from Bingle that we've just looked at, exists in Australia, and it's in part responsible, I'd argue, for what Jonathan Dunk, who isn't here to appreciate being cited, calls the motif of the wild white man. But for the most part, I want to boldly suggest that the two most powerful mythic architectures for settler imagining of Australia are the pastoral, a landscape morally redeemed by, and indeed aesthetically redeemed, by clearing, sheep, and white labour, and the biblical type of hell or exile from paradise. Hell, or as William Lyons put it, the opposite of a prelapsarian Eden. And I don't know if we have a word for the opposite of prelapsarian, post-lapsarian, doesn't sound quite right. So if you have a term for the opposite of prelapsarian Eden, please let me know before I take this paper anywhere else. Okay, so it's been a few minutes since I've mentioned snakes. So what am I doing? Well, snakes are, of course, central to the biblical story of the fall from grace and human exile from Eden or paradise. Eve and Adam break divine law. God's punishment is to put them at war with nature, represented through an enmity between snakes and women. So here we are in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, and punitive God says to the snake in verse 14, "Thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." At the same time, it's worth noting that God invents painful labour at this moment, the pain of childbirth and the pain of agrarian labour. God says to Adam, as thou hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. Oh no, that sounds terrible. In the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. This narrative of exile to a land of dusty, barren, sweat-inducing labour plays out throughout 19th century colonial Australia, but it really starts to take shape in the literature of the 1890s. powered in part by the Federation drought, in part by the economic depression, and in part by the pressure of imminent federation to cement an Australian identity. Henry Lawson's poem Up the Country, which again invokes the Old Testament theme of exile in the 40-year period of the Israelites wandering through the desert between their exile or escape from Egypt and their invasion of the so-called promised land of Canaan. Right, so sorry, this is this poem Up the Country, which begins, I am back from up the country, very sorry that I went, seeking for the southern poet's land whereon to pitch my tent. I have lost a lot of idols. This is a moment where he compares himself with Moses leading the Israelites / southern poets, which were broken on the track, burnt a lot of fancy verses, and I'm glad that I am back. And then he's back in Sydney, where he can drink lemon squashes, a lot of beer, I guess prefiguring his imminent alcohol addiction, take baths and cool down. This comparison of himself with Moses and this sense of himself as kind of leading an exiled population is made explicit when he compares the ever-maddening flies of New South Wales to the plagues of Egypt. And we get these images of an exilic hellscape in the form of the Australian bush, an infernal furnace on a plain devoid of grass, and the figure of the snake is invoked as one of the symptoms of how benighted and inhospitable this country is. And I guess it's no surprise that by the time of this book's publication, Lawson has given up on New South Wales and decamped to the place he calls Maori land, a land of no snakes. So I want to turn now with some trepidation to Henry Lawson's short story, The Drover's Wife, realizing that I don't identify as an Auslit person particularly, and this is quite a shibboleth in Australian literary studies. So those of you who are Auslitsters, please thank you for your indulgence as I try to talk about this text, which, as Frank Morehouse has said, is white Australia's Mona Lisa. The much represented, the most represented text of Australian something or other. So The Drover's Wife was first published in the Bulletin in 1892 and later in 1894 in Lawson's collection Short Stories in Prose and Verse. The story is often figured as the tale of a resilient woman left with her 4 children to battle the elements. The present tense event that structures this story, as you all know, I'm sure, is the presence of the snake in the bark hut, where the woman is trying to keep herself and her dog Alligator and her 4 young children safe. But that present tense event gives rise to a long, wakeful night, during which she waits with her stick at the ready to kill the snake, and that becomes the occasion for reflecting on all of the outrages that she has had to endure. The bushfire she's had to fight alone, unassisted childbirth, the flooding rain that she tries to divert before it destroys her dam, the deaths of her cows, pneumonia, swagmen threatening sexual assault, etc., etc. And through all of this is the presence of the people Lawson, or his central character at least, think of as the blacks, who are not human exactly, but mythic figures in a Christianized understanding of exilic suffering. God sent, the narrator says, Black Mary, the whitest gin in all the land, to help the drover's wife through childbirth. So there's this kind of mythic, redemptive figure of blackness, but there's also the implied demon figure. The drover's wife recalls how when she was covered in soot from fighting fire, she went to take up her baby. Where's this? I don't have a quote for this, sorry. She went to take up her baby, and he screamed and struggled convulsively, thinking she was, as Lawson writes, a black man. After her night awake, she recollects that the day before the day that the snake turned up, she had been bargaining with as Lawson, kind of focalizing through her, says, a stray black fellow, bargaining with him to bring her some wood, and while he was at work, she went in search of a missing cow. She was absent an hour or so, and the black made good use of his time. On her return, she was astonished by seeing a great heap of wood by the chimney. She gave him an extra fig of tobacco and praised him for not being lazy. He thanked her and left with head erect, but, and we read this in italics that emphasize the moral gap between his performance and his real duplicity in the story, He built the wood heap hollow. And it's implied, I think, that by doing this, it was him who created a harbour by the house for the snake. The story creates, if not exactly an identification between this so-called stray black fellow and this snake in the wrong place, then at least a causal relationship between this man's actions and the woman's predicament. So I want to just read the climactic scene of the story. The woman's been up all night. She's had her children camped on the table, and the dog has been kind of bristling at the sideboard, and she's been kind of clutching her stick, waiting for the moment when the snake makes an appearance. It must be near daylight now. The room is very close and hot because of the fire. Alligator still watches the wall from time to time. Suddenly he becomes greatly interested. He draws himself a few inches nearer the partition, and a thrill runs through his body. The hair on the back of his neck begins to bristle, and the battle light is in his yellow eyes. She knows what this means and lays her hand on the stick. The lower end of one of the partition slabs has a large crack on each side of it. An evil pair of small, bright, bead-like eyes glisten at one of these holes. The snake, a black one, comes slowly out, about a foot, and moves its head up and down. The dog lies still, and the woman sits as one fascinated. The snake comes out a foot farther. She lifts her stick, and the reptile, as though suddenly aware of danger, sticks his head in through the crack on the other side of the slab and hurries to get his tail round after him. Alligator springs, and his jaws come together with a snap. He misses this time, for his nose is large, and the snake's body close down in the angle formed by the slabs and the floor. He snaps again as the tail comes round. He has the snake now, and tugs it out 18 inches. Thud, thud, comes the woman's club on the ground. Alligator pulls back. Thud, thud. Alligator pulls some more. He has the snake out now. A black brute, 5 feet long. The head rises to dart about, but the dog has the enemy close to the neck. He is a big, heavy dog, but as quick as a terrier. He shakes the snake as though he felt the curse of toil in common with mankind. The eldest boy wakes up, seizes his stick, and tries to get out of bed, but his mother forces him back with a grip of iron. Thud, thud. The snake's back is broken in several places. Thud, thud. The head is crushed, and Alligator's nose skinned again. There's a lot to say about this scene, but as I'm sure you've noticed, Lawson labours the fact that the snake is black. The snake, a black one, we read, and then a few lines later, a black brute, 5 feet long. This story is a pivotal one in the myth-making of Australian identity. The drover's wife, as I've already said, Frank Morehouse has said, is the Mona Lisa of white Australia. That is, holds the kind of cultural symbolic significance for Australia that the Mona Lisa supposedly holds for Italy or France or Southern Europe or the world or something. She's one of the most representative figures. And Lawson, who calls her not just a bushwoman, but an Australian, is laying down a type here. A type that earns its right to nationhood through this biblical battle with the snake, who is, as we see, evil, an evil pair of eyes, we read. When Alligator seizes it, he seizes it feeling the curse of toil inflicted by God during the exile from Eden on mankind, but equally inflicted on the drover's wife by living in this bush place 19 miles from the nearest sign of civilization, a shanty on the main road. Or so goes one reading, at least. I do want to open the possibility of an ironic gap between Lawson's perspective and that of the drover's wife and of Alligator, that he's not so much seeking to create as simply to narrate, perhaps not with approbation, an already created myth of white possession by right of frontier suffering, in line with the idea of kind of human redemption through labour, suffering, childbirth, etc. Lawson's own perspective seems a bit less elusive in his short article Bush Cats, published in the 1894 Short Stories in Prose and Verse, along with The Drover's Wife. So, among many other things he tells us about bush cats is the Australian bush cat having a nasty, unpleasant habit of dragging a long, wriggling, horrid black snake. She seems to prefer black snakes into a room where there are ladies, and in such cases the cat will proudly lay the snake down in a conspicuous place, usually in front of the exit, and then look up for approbation and wonder perhaps why the visitors are in such a blessed hurry to leave. I guess what emerges here against the doughty drover's wife, and indeed against the figure of the Australian bush cat, are the figures of the ladies, who are demonstrably unequal to the epithet bush, as in bushwoman or bush cat, or even Australian, that Lawson gives the drover's wife and the Australian bush cat. Lawson goes on to tell the story of a neighbour's cat who went out in the scrub one midsummer's day and found a brown snake. Her name was Mary Ann. That's the cat rather than the snake, I think we can assume. She got hold of the snake all right, just within an inch of its head, but it got the rest of its length wound round her body and squeezed about 8 lives out of her. She had the presence of mind to keep her hold, but it struck her that she was in a fix, and that if she wanted to save her ninth life, it would be a bad idea to go. Wouldn't be a bad idea to go home for help. So she started home, snake and all. The family were at dinner when Mary Ann came in, and although she stood on an open part of the floor, no one noticed her for a while. She couldn't ask for help, for her mouth was too full of snake. By and by, one of the girls glanced round, and then went over the table with a shriek and out of the back door. The room was cleared very quickly. The eldest boy got a long-handled shovel, and in another second he'd have killed more cat than snake, but his father interfered. The father was a shearer, and Mary Ann was a favourite cat with him. He got a pair of shears from the shelf and deftly shore off the snake's head and one side of Mary Ann's whiskers. She didn't think it safe to let go yet. She kept her teeth in the neck until the selector snipped the rest of the snake off her. The bits were carried out on a shovel to die at sundown. Mary Ann had a good drink of milk and then got her tongue out and licked herself back into the proper shape for a cat. After which, she went out to look for that snake's mate. She found it too and dragged it home the same evening. So it's a kind of funny story in the genre of Aunt Pet's crazy, but it's also the story of the practicality of a labouring man. It's the father of the family who comes to the rescue with a facility that's made possible because of his trade, because he has his shears handy. And this is consonant with Lawson's politics. As Manu Chanda has written, Lawson conceived of Australia as the working man's land, and in his early work especially, figured England as the bourgeois oppressor to be overthrown. Chanda goes on to say, ironically, this sensibility made him rather attractive to London audiences, who could only recognise as a cultural representative of the colony one whose work embodied the ruggedness associated with Australia within the English cultural imaginary. Regardless of how Lawson identifies himself with the working men and women of Australia, I do think in celebrating them through their defeat of the snake, he's returning to the story of exile from Eden, in which God curses Adam and men with hard manual labour and curses Eve and women with painful childbirth, and an eternity of enmity between her descendants and snakes. In 1893, Lawson wrote in the Bulletin, "We wish to heaven that Australian writers would leave off trying to make a paradise out of the outback hell, if only out of consideration for the poor, hopeless, half-starved wretches who carry swags through it and look for work." There may be a gap between Lawson and his working-class protagonists, and I think they share their sense, that they are fighting a cosmic battle against the fallen hellscape that is life in Australia, and for which snakes, especially black snakes, become a kind of synecdoche. I think there's probably another paper to be written in how the biblical enmity between snakes and Eve's descendants play out in the self-nativizing children's literature of white Australia, in the figure of what have we got? Wicked Mrs. Snake from Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, May Gibbs's 1918 collection. Mrs. Snake is an ally of the big bad Banksia men, who are figures of contrast with the white little cherubic native babylets of the gumnut babies. And then there's Mrs. Snake from Blinky Bill, who applies for the role of koala nursemaid and then later attempts to kill the young bear, as he's called. I'm not going to say anything more about that, but I do just want to commend to Evelyn Aralewin's Snugglepot and Cuddlepie and the Ghost Gum, an essay that deals with some of this iconography of settler self-romanticization. Okay, so I said some time ago in this chat that I would be differentiating between representations of snakes for a colonial readership and representations of Australian snakes for a British readership. And so in the last chapter, if you like, of this paper, I'm going to take a bold anti-chronological diversion back to the 1700s, when almost all of the written accounts of animals in this region were intended for European eyes. And one of the things that has struck me as I've begun to assemble a little corpus of white-authored 18th century accounts of Australian snakes is how routinely they stress the snake's beauty. So this is the first Australian snake to be named by a Western scientist who calls it the Coluber porphyriacus, Coluber being a non-venomous genus. It's, of course, since been reclassified as an elapid, and this is the red-bellied black snake that I have been talking about quite a lot. So George Shaw, who's responsible for the book in which this appears, The Zoology of New Holland, published in 1794, describes this as a beautiful snake, not of a poisonous nature. On the upper parts is a glossy violet black, the sides of an elegant deep crimson, while the scuta are deeply bordered with black. The largest series of crimson side scales are tipped with black, which gives them an appearance peculiarly elegant. So very aestheticizing language there, and we might also remark on the illustration that goes with it, which I think is beautiful. It's beautiful to my eye. It represents this snake, as with much 18th century natural history illustration, as a collectible, to be absolutely detached from its environment and arranged on the page in a way pleasing to the eye. And indeed, cultivated English eyes of the late 18th century had been taught to think of snakes as inherently visually pleasing. Here is the title page of William Hogarth's aesthetic treatise, The Analysis of Beauty. And I just, in my endeavour to cite as many people as I can who are present today, I just want to note Killian Quigley once gave a paper in which he talked about this book, and possibly Killian's gone on to publish about Hogarth. Anyway, this is the title page of William Hogarth's The Analysis of Beauty, and you can see there he quotes a couplet from John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, where Milton describes Satan in the form of a serpent, making his veering, shifting, sublimely alluring progress towards Eve. So this is the couplet. So varied he, and of his tortuous train, curled many a wanton wreath in sight of Eve to lure her eye. And these lines, rather, are printed above the word variety on the title page of the book, where they supplement Hogarth's sketch of a serpentine line with a tiny snake's head, the so-called Hogarthian line of beauty. If anyone's read Alan Hollinghead's novel of that title, you might know about the line of beauty imprisoned within a transparent pyramid. So the identification of the snake with the beautiful via that serpentine shape, or the wanton wreath in Milton's terms that lures the eye. So George Shaw was far from alone amongst cultivated, educated Englishmen of the late 1700s in being ready to see snakes as inherently beautiful. And so we're seeing again and again this happening amongst commentators on Australian snakes. Certainly not settler commentators, but people who are transiting through. So Watkin Tench writes about large snakes, beautifully variegated, which have been killed. And more pragmatically, he notes that of the effect of their bites, we're happily ignorant. And these are likely the same snakes commonly known to Sydney-siders as diamond pythons. Daniel Southall, who's a lieutenant on the First Fleet on HMS Sirius, writes in his diary in May 1788, probably citing the very same snakes that Tench notes were killed. There are also large snakes 2.5 yards long, beautifully checkered with a variety of colours and scaled all over. So I have started to amass more examples of people reflecting on snakes' beauty. I've got a Joseph Banks example as well, not sharing with you today. There are, of course, more than one reason for the discrepancy between the ways these late 18th century natural historians and officers who are just passing through New South Wales refer to snakes and the ways settlers refer to them. And one of those reasons, to be fair to the settler colonists, is their experience of witnessing lethal snake bite. But I hope I've shown over the course of this paper that the powerful narrative of exile and the consciousness If not of the violence of settler occupation of Aboriginal land, then the violence of Aboriginal resistance to it finds metaphorical purchase in the very literal figure of the snake, and especially the black snake. And there I end my paper. So thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Alexis. Much to think about there. And I see Rachel has quite a few comments
Yeah,
I
excellent.
want to have a look at.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah, antediluvian. I was thinking about that, thinking there's no well, there are Australian flood stories, but it's not a sort of there's no great flood, I don't think, in the kind of national mythology.
Sorry, shall I just talk? I meant, you said you didn't know if there was a word for after the fall.
Yeah. That's right.
I wondered if, like, antediluvian
Would cut it. Yeah.
Also, you're quite right. Ken and I don't know anything about religion, but sometimes we like to pretend. Ken loves that phrase, prelapsarian.
Oh, excellent. Yes. I'm sorry. I slightly
we're pretending to know about religion.
Oh, no. I really appreciated your reading of that Bingle passage, and then became like strangely combative over the word prelapsarian. So
No,
but a citation's a citation, right?
I think you'd be wrong, but I enjoyed the citation.
Thanks. That's kind.
And I thought of some other possible leads for you.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, C.J. Dennis. Yeah, I mean, pushing into the 20th century.
Yeah, a bit late, I think. But Dad and Dave had, I would say you'd find some bounty there.
Oh, yes. And I mean, also, so I didn't talk about this because I just thought maybe I shouldn't talk for overly long, and also I'm just not organized enough. But Miles Franklin, what's it called? Sorry, I'm such an Auslit person. My Brilliant Career has pretty important, some snake scenes in it, and is another kind of crucial Federation Australian literary moment text. And also Tom Collins, Such is Life. There's a snake bite in Such is Life.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
And
also thinking that there are lots of, like, there've got to be like sad stories about little children dying in the bush.
Yes, there must be. And I mean, besides the real ones.
When your mind goes blank when you try to think of something.
There's also a really Seven Little Australians, Ethel Turner's.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that book so much lately, because why does Judy have to die under the tree? I've always had that feeling, and now I feel like I know why. You're hearing from me soon.
So there's a chapter of that book that goes missing from 1897 for about 100 years, and it's a chapter in which a story by a supposed Aboriginal story is relayed, and it's a story about a blue wren that is caught by a snake, and then the snake disgorges it and it escapes unharmed. And it's fascinating that A, the story is fascinating, and B, its suppression for 100 years is fascinating. And I feel like
publication of that book without that chapter in it.
Yes. So it was published. It was published with the chapter, and then 3 years later, that chapter was removed, and it remained removed for a century. So that's I mean, people have talked about that.
Yeah, it's so annoying when you're trying to read something though, and then that you realize they've cut out half of what you talk about in another edition, and then you eternally have to kind of like explain yourself to people. I was reading a different version. It's like they're like, what?
Yeah, it certainly sorts the Johnny come latelys from the people who've been working in the field for their whole lives. Speaking as a Johnny come lately.
No, I'm that as well.
Yes, I just have a question. It's a very sort of basic question about the biblical typology and then moving to the aestheticizing, the kind of beauty of these snakes. And whether you've come across anything that is sort of in between. I guess it's my favorite snake poem ever is Emily Dickinson's A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. where I would say the snake is neither of those things. It's a, what is it, a chilling at the bone? It's notice, sudden is. It's the, I don't know, it goes to the etymology of the word, just this creature that creeps along and all of a sudden it's there and you get this instant thrilling but frightening, you know, chilling
Yeah.
response. So
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, there's a long 18th century kind of nature poem called The Seasons, which has some very pretty snakes in it. And I mean, obviously Milton's Paradise Lost is not, it's not unrelated to the Bible. But and romantic primitivism is not unrelated to the Bible either, but it's kind of refracted through a different set of concerns, I think. But so that's a good question, Monique, for which I don't have a better answer. I mean, I will be on the lookout in Australian literature, and I guess I should just, Carrie is here, and Carrie's just done some amazing writing about snakes, which is not at all playing into, I don't think, this exile from Eden myth at all, and is also not appropriating the rainbow serpent kind of narrative, which is kind of vital, which is like, it's very distinctive Carrie Tiffany work that I recommend you all pursue. Is that a good answer?
Yes.
About the Dickinson, Judith Bishop and a few other people have been putting narrow fellow in the grass into some large language models and asking just the first stanza and asking it to complete that poem. And it does. And the last line of that poem is, the Dickinson poem is zero to the bone, you know, as the snake goes by. And the AI finishes the poem, sort of, the snake slithers sweetly past. And anyway, the idea of this is we show these to students and we ask them which poem they prefer, you know, so there is the Dickinson poem in there and there are the AI poems. They don't know which is the real poem. And I'm very, very sad to say they all choose slithering sweetly.
No. That seems like poetry because it's alliteration or something.
Oh yes, Neil Rudd. Thanks, Rachel.
Any further questions?
Yeah, maybe I'll ask a question. I don't know if it's useful or anything, but I'll put it out there. I'm thinking of Rikki Tikki Tavi, Kipling's story, which is like, I think it's like 1893, so that would come out like exactly the same time as the Drover's Wife. And in that story, as you'll know, it's a mongoose versus a snake. Rikki Tikki Tavi is an Indian mongoose who kills the evil snake who's creeping into the bungalow to bite the English family in India, and then he also has to kill the snake's evil wife by stealing his egg and holding it and so on. So it's not not wanting to go too hard on a crazy allegorical reading of this story, but the fact that the snake and the mongoose are both native Indian animals, it's not too hard to see it as some kind of allegory of a you've got on the one hand, you've got the good natives who side with the English and work with them to protect the family against the dangerous bad natives that are out there. I'm just thinking of the kind of like comparable story looked at would be the cat Marianne, and all the little dogs and all the terriers. They're all European domestic animals that are taking these snakes on. There's no equivalent of a kind of like native, not a native informant, a native snake hunter or something. I mean, do you think is that difference tell us anything useful about the kind of ways people are thinking about the colonization of Australia as against the colonization of a place like India? Do you think?
I think that's a excellent question, Tom, that I will need to ponder a bit more.
I just like Kipling. That's basically I'm like a secret Kipling fan.
Oh, okay, sure. This is going on the internet. But yeah, it's out. Tom Ford, Kipling fan. Yeah, I mean, there's a few things to say, but I don't know if I'll be able to answer that excellent question. One is that there sort of is, in Drover's Wife, there is the figure of the so-called Black Mary, who is this woman who turns up in the nick of time. The drover's wife has had a kind of antenatal fever, is giving birth. Her husband's gone off, who knows how far off, to get the drunken doctor to come and help. But she's alone giving birth, and Black Mary, the whitest gin to ever live, turns up to help. So and she's, I guess, contrasted with the stray black fellow who comes and builds this duplicitous hollow wood heap that provides a habitation for the snake. So that doesn't speak to native species. That it's it's more, but in terms of an allegory for kind of two types of the friendly, supportive Indigenous person versus the sneaky one. There's a similarity there. And then this is not super relevant, but kind of points to two colonies that are both imperial cousins. And that is, I stumbled on a newspaper article in the 1860s about some experiments in the best kind of snake bite repellent clothing. And the experiments were undertaken in India using good colonial tweed and other fabrics to see which was the best at inhibiting snake venom from getting to and they dressed dogs up once again in these different fabrics, and then put them in a situation where a snake would try to bite them, and then assessed the amount of venom that penetrated the fabric, and then in some cases the dogs died. But good colonial tweed was the winner for sheer absorbance of venom, and was recommended. So this is a learning from India that was being exported to Australia, and here you go, people in Australia, you can take on this learning. And so there's this intercolonial kind of communication about how to deal with the pan-imperial problem of snakebite. So maybe I could work that up into a kind of Kipling versus Lawson snake story comparison.
It's just a further, Killian first.
Oh, if you have something on that, Monique, please, I'm happy to
Well,
wait.
no, I guess just very briefly, just the period of time, the pre-Federation period, you called it, I think, early on, and this military and naval presence, which interested to hear mention of, that Australia is a garrison state, or the pre-Federation, it's a garrison state. And I just had some vague thought about the snake as not a respecter of boundaries in any way. So that kind of creeping idea of the snake. And again, coming back to Kipling, but Dickinson, my favourite, and not an unusual favourite at all.
Yeah, not a respecter of boundaries. And so something else that was kind of striking to me rereading The Drover's Wife is that there are all these figures, Aboriginal people and snakes, who are represented as disrespecting boundaries, as posing a threat. But ironically, as we can see, I think, that they are transgressing the very boundaries that, in fact, colonials are transgressing. So that moment where the baby thinks that, so the drover's wife has become covered in soot because she's been fighting a fire, and she turns up, and the baby is distressed, thinking that his mother is a black man come to abduct him, and that is the very obverse of what what actually happens in colonial history. And then the infiltration of someone's home is the very opposite of, and the attempts at trade, like doing a fair swap where one side deceives the other, is these are all kind of affronts that colonists have made against Aboriginal people, but here they're being inverted in this story.
Thanks a lot, Alexis. That was really great. Really enjoyed it. And I'm totally an expert when it comes to most of your kind of texts. So forgive me if this feels mostly beside the point. But I think I have like maybe a comment and a question. I was trying to figure out how to put them together, but I'm not sure I was able to do that. But I guess my first thing was like, in some ways I'm just playing to type, but like one thing that I do think is really promising about the sort of Hogarth angle is that like the sort of snaky motion like is so interesting, and it seems like there's something very particular about movement, even in the examples that you gave that I myself just sitting here am finding really, really interesting. I mean, I've been thinking lately a bit recently about the water snakes in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and the kind of exhibition, the kind of show of movement of a very specific sort of movement that they put on. And I guess maybe I will try to put these things together, but I guess there, like with the water snakes, it seems like there's this really specific relationship being worked out between movement and life, or movement and sort of animacy. And that came to mind and maybe I'm just like totally misreading, right? But that came to mind in what I took to be a couple of moments in your excerpts where something is made of the fact that the snake like goes on living, or like isn't altogether dead after its head is cut off. This like idea about, we all sort of are familiar with that idea about snakes. I think it was in the one where the cat brings the snake inside, and then maybe in one of the very early examples too, like maybe the first one. Sorry, this is already becoming a bit of a ramble. Maybe my question is simply like, what do you think about those moments where the issue of life beyond death, or movement construed as life beyond death, kind of becomes a concern?
Yeah, cool. I mean, that passage in the Bush Cats story where the shearer takes the pieces of the brown snake outside on his shovel, as Lawson says, to die at sundown, is it's an amazing image.
Mm.
And I mean, in my reading, just amplifies the sense that this is in part a story about something, a kind of cosmic warfare. Like this is a biblical style death of Christ situation or something, but the opposite of, like, I don't know. I might be getting too attached to my reading and trying to push that line a bit too hard. Yeah, I mean, I think that's I mean, it's also part of the kind of the weirdness of certain. It's weird to many of us to see bodies moving after we think they've died. So like the headless chicken that's wings, whose wings still beat, and the snake that still wriggles after. There's something very, very uncanny to many of us in that. I'm not sure what else to say about that, but I love that you brought up the water snakes from Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because Tom will be so pleased that I'm doing this, because he is constantly, no, this is not the book. Anyway, sorry, there's this book by by this Australian art historian whose name, Tom, is
that'd be Bernard Smith, I'm pretty sure.
Bernard Smith, thank you. Thanks. Who wrote this book?
European Vision in the South Pacific.
European Vision in the South Pacific. This is going really well. Thanks for being memory prosthesis there. And he was the first person to put the possibility that Coleridge, who had been taught at Christ's Hospital by by a mathematician and astrologer from Cook's second voyage. They have been exposed via him to accounts of water snakes and also icebergs in this hemisphere.
Yeah.
And Joseph Banks writes about water snakes in his on his journal, kind of trekking up the side of the coastline of Eastern Australia. So it's quite possible that it's Australian water snakes reflected in Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Yeah.
Which is quite exciting, actually. And part of the story of the I guess, the sort of aestheticization of these animals for a European imagination in a complicated way. Yeah, that's all I can say, I think.
No, that's really great. No, I just think that thing about, I mean, it felt like it sort of came up in something, was it Monique was talking before about sort of the creeping snake, or the way the snake sort of appears. There's this thing about the snake as an organism and the snake as a kind of principle of motion or something like that. Just seems really, really exciting to me about your paper. So yeah, thanks.
Cool. Oh, great things happening in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. Maybe that's enough. Oh, you're muted, Monique.
Well, it's been more than enough. It's been fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thanks, wonderful audience, for all the great thoughts. Oh, thanks, Rachel. That's lovely.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you. I forgot my last slide. I'll just share my slides again. I just wanted to share this this friend. I hope this is a reward for coming. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
They're really gorgeous. I have these beautiful, sorry, I don't know how you all feel about this. I possibly should have, I think the title of the talk was a trigger warning enough. I just, yeah, I like these ones.
I also think it's beautiful. Amazing.
All right, on that note, thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. That was great.
Thank you.